Hunter, have you ever been to Alaska before?
I have been to Alaska. I haven't spent a lot of time there, but I went there for kind of a long weekend because I had a friend who had to go there, and I was able to get a ticket pretty cheap. And it was in January, I think, so it was in the
Oh boy.
winter. And we flew into Anchorage, and I was just amazed by the scale of everything there, the scale of the natural environment. I felt like I was just going to disappear, maybe, or something. And
I
driving down the street, and there'd be a moose walking down the street, sort of. I don't know if they just released those for the tourists or something, but
They do not know.
yeah, right. So, yeah, I was just amazed at how massive everything felt and how small I felt compared to what was going on.
Alaska is, I think, for lack of a better word, just a really big country. It's not to say that it's an independent country, but just like the landforms, right? It's just really big. Everybody likes to say everything's bigger in Texas, and I think Alaska actually might have that crown there.
Yeah, no, it's just the scale of the mountains and just everything is, for people who live there, that's one thing. But for people who are visiting it for the first time, it's super impressive.
Totally. So I used to live up in Alaska. I
Yeah.
lived up there when I was a kid for a little bit. I remember the summers being really awesome, the winters being really cold and dark. The moose example that you brought up, Hunter, is not definitely a tourist thing. I think it's more of a nuisance, if I recall correctly. And same with bears. If I remember, I lived in Anchorage, and I kind of remember like every once in a while there'd just be like, "Hey, there's a bear out here." The Alaska, whatever wildlife people would have to come out and harangue it back into the wilderness nearby. Because as it turns out, Anchorage is not. It's like the big city in Alaska, but it's not that big. It's only about 300,000 people total. So it's like pretty small relative to really any other major city in the US, but certainly relative to the land that's surrounding it.
Yeah, and there aren't any other big cities around it either. So
Nope.
that's
Nope.
that's
It's up there basically alone. I mean, the nearest big cities would be Fairbanks, which is much farther north, and it's about 100,000 people. And then the capital, Juneau, which is over inside the archipelago, over on sort of what we call the panhandle of Alaska, and that's about 50-ish thousand people. So
Okay.
all this is to say, it's a very big place. Getting to from one Anchorage to either of those other two cities is a Herculean effort in terms of driving, or you can't even drive to Juneau. You have to fly there. So it's really big. It's a really huge place. And we are going to talk all about Alaska today because, well, all the reasons we kind of just talked about. It's a really big state, but it also happens to be one of the United States, what I would say is sort of their far-flung states or territories, right? It's oftentimes we like to think of the United States as just being the contiguous United States, right? The landmass that we share, down here, we're here based in Oregon, but New York, Florida, Texas, California, Wyoming, all these other states all crammed together down here. That's sort of the typical, imagination of somebody who might think of the United States.
Yeah,
but Alaska is also part of the United States.
that's right. But it hasn't been for all that long. So, for example, my parents grew up in a United States of which Alaska and Hawaii they weren't states at the time. There were 48
Exactly.
states at the time. Yeah.
Exactly. It's also a very recent state. So it doesn't have the same kind of, I mean, I guess, and we're going to talk about the history a bit, but Americans have been here for quite a while to some degree, but there's a lot of nuances at play. And it took a long time for Alaska, probably more time than most territories to become sort of a full state. And that sort of comes with a lot of, I would say, hangups in terms of how they see how native Alaskans certainly, but also, Alaskans who've just lived there for a long time sort of see themselves in their relationship with the rest of the country. And I'm glad you brought up Hawaii, Hunter, because we're actually, this is kind of two-parter where we're going to do Alaska this week that I'm hosting, and then we're going to do Hawaii next week with you.
Stay tuned for next week when we'll be talking about Hawaii.
Yeah. It's the United States, two far-flung states. So they're different in a way. And I did want to bring up, I mentioned contiguous United States earlier. Alaska would be part of what's called the continental United States because it is part of the North American continent, which is just something I think to call out because that's going to be different from when we talk about Hawaii, which is neither contiguous nor continental.
That's right. But yeah, in the case of Alaska, there's a lot of Canada in between as well. So
a whole lot of Canada.
A whole lot
of Canada. All right. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. And I just want to make one point here. This episode's not just going to be about oil. We will talk very briefly about oil, but having lived in Alaska for a period of time, I feel like so much of the state often gets boiled down to just about oil. And I kind of wanted to veer away from that as much as possible. So we'll touch on it, but a lot of what we're going to be talking about is sort of Alaska, the place itself. So all that said, let's situate ourselves a little bit. Not everybody knows where Alaska is, even maybe some people within the United States. That's fine. We're going to help you figure it out. Alaska is in the very far Northwest. In fact, we're here in the Pacific Northwest of the contiguous United States. I would argue that Alaska is probably the real Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, we think we're the Northwest, but there's a Northwesterner than us.
Exactly. In fact, actually, if we want to be like sort of, more nuanced about it, it might actually be more appropriately called the Arctic Northwest.
Right.
But it's definitely, in terms of the North American continent, it is the Northwest of North America. It's very far up there. It is the largest state in the country. Do you know about how big Alaska is, Hunter?
I don't have a number in mind. I'm just thinking of that website we went to where you can drag Alaska down and you can see. Or I don't know, maybe you can't do that with the states, but I've seen.
No, you absolutely can.
Oh, you can. Okay, and so then you bring it down to the United States, and it's still really big, but it's not quite as big as it would seem to be on various projections, Mercator and such.
Exactly. So it's the largest state in the country by far. It's about 660,000 square miles, and if we use our favorite system of measurement, that would be about 132 Connecticut's in size.
That's a lot of Connecticut's, yeah.
We'll use another state as a comparison here in a second. But what you were just alluding to is that, there's that website. It's called truesizeof.com or something like that. And you can go and you can select Alaska and you can drag it around. And Alaska, it's using the Mercator projection. So Alaska looks really large. In fact, if you sort of zoom out and you see the contiguous United States and Alaska, you can kind of assume based on that projection that Alaska is about half of the total area size of the contiguous United States. The reality is it's not that big. In fact, it's only about the size of 2.5 Texases.
Which
so
is
it's still large.
Which is a lot, but maybe not as much as it would appear on a lot of maps.
But not as much as it would appear. But fun fact, if you split the state in half, right? So now you have North Alaska and you have South Alaska, two wholly separate states, just like we have North Dakota and South Dakota. If you split those states in half, North Alaska and South Alaska would be the first and second largest states, respectively.
Okay, yeah.
So again, a really large state, right? And so within this state, there are very few people. Do you know how many people are in Alaska?
All right, so I'm trying to think of what you said for the cities, and I'm guessing there's under 1 million people.
There's less than 1 million people. That is true. There are, all told, 733,000 people living in Alaska as of 2020. Now, that's changed a little bit.
Sure.
We're going to talk about it in a second. But I think what's perhaps most surprising in all of this, Hunter, is that Alaska is not the smallest state in terms of population in the country. In fact, do you know what the two smallest states would be?
I'm going to go with Wyoming and Vermont.
Wyoming and Vermont, both smaller in total population than Alaska, which when you start to think about how remote Alaska is and the climatic differences, right? It can be a pretty inhospitable state, right? It can be very cold, very Arctic, as compared to Wyoming, which does have some climatic issues, but it's sort of right there in the middle of the state. In fact, really close to Colorado, which is a very populous state. And then Vermont, which is based in New England, also around other very populous states. Kind of surprising that neither of them have as many people as Alaska, in my opinion.
Sounds like a future episode to me.
I think so. We got to answer that question. Certainly for Wyoming. Wyoming's a whole other deal. But this would make Alaska the 48th largest state in the country by population. So ahead of Vermont and Wyoming, as you had already said, Hunter, though it would be the least densely populated state. And I don't think that's probably a surprise.
No, that adds up pretty well. Yeah.
Yeah. Apparently there are only about 1.3 people per square mile And so to put this in perspective, the next highest state would be Wyoming, or yeah, I guess that's phrased correctly. The next highest state would be Wyoming, which has about 6 people per square mile, so significantly less dense. So that's kind of, I mean, just like imagine, like, I mean, again, we're here in a city. There's obviously going to be a lot of people per square mile where we are, but it's just like sitting in the middle of like this wide open area and just knowing there's not that many other people around you. There's actually no other people.
If you take those 3 big city, bigger cities out of it that you mentioned,
right?
Juneau, Fairbanks, and Anchorage, then the density is even much less. There are, I think, a lot of communities with, that are pretty small. And so there's a lot of elbow room, I suppose, for people in a lot of communities in Alaska compared to other places.
To help add further context here, Hunter, if you can, take a guess at what the most densely populated state is.
New Jersey?
It is New Jersey. I guess you're from that general area, so I guess
I'm from the tri-state area, so I know about this kind of thing.
I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but it is significantly more dense. Do you want to hazard a guess about how many people per square mile there are?
I would just be throwing out numbers. I don't know, 50?
Oh, it's way more than that. There's about 1,200 people per square mile.
1,200, okay.
Throughout the entire state of New Jersy.
I guess I need to brush up on my density statistics a little bit.
It's all right. This isn't a math class. But it's funny because if you do think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? It's like the northern part of New Jersey gets very much wrapped up into the New York metropolitan region. Very dense area. The southern part gets very much wrapped up into the Philadelphia metro area. Again, another very dense city. Yep. And then there's other areas, but Atlantic City has its own thing going on. There's sort of not that much open space in terms of actual like open areas, in the same way that perhaps Alaska.
Right. Although New Jersey's license plate says the Garden State, if I'm not mistaken. So I mean,
everybody gets a garden, I guess.
Everybody gets a garden. Yeah.
All right, so we've situated ourselves. Now let's go ahead and jump into some history. Let's go way back before the United States or even European colonization, because as it turns out, people have been living in Alaska for a long, long time. In fact, I was actually kind of surprised, and actually maybe I wasn't as surprised. I would have been surprised had we not done an episode on Greenland, where I think we covered this same sort of topic. But some historic estimates put early inhabitants to Alaska as arriving somewhere around or before 10,000 BCE, before Common Era.
Wow. Okay.
That's a long time.
Yeah, it's a long time.
This would be, way before the Roman Empire, right? The Roman Empire
way
I think
before.
was probably around, like 1,000 BCE to 500 CE, something like that. I'm not super into the Roman Empire.
Maybe even a smaller window than that, but yeah, thousands and thousands of years before that.
Right. And so apparently Paleolithic families moved into northwestern North America across the Bering Land Bridge in Alaska. Do you know what the Bering Land Bridge is?
So this would have been a time when there was more water in glaciers in the planet, and the area that strait would have been exposed land, and so thus bridging what is now Russia and what is now Alaska. Exactly.
Yeah. So exactly what you said. So the Bering Strait, which is the sort of the water body that separates Russia and Alaska today, is actually fairly shallow, all things considered, right? That's obviously you're not going to go swim to the bottom of the Bering Strait or wade through it. But relative to, say, the depths of the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean, it's relatively shallow. So during I think it was called the last glacial maximum, is what they called it. That was when so much more water was sort of withheld into large glaciers, in sort of the North and South Pole. And so therefore there was simply just less water floating around inside our oceans. And so
the last glacial maximum, like 17,000 years ago, something
I think it was
in the neighborhood.
15, something around that. Yeah, it was well over 10,000 years ago. I think you were right. I think it's probably 15 to 17,000 is probably the age range for it. And during this time is when this land bridge was present and people could literally just walk across. In fact, there was probably plants and animals and other things that looked and felt relatively normal. It's not like it wasn't like a completely barren area,
right? And I
because
suppose people didn't have the sensation that we're crossing into an area that's usually covered by water. That probably didn't come up, right? They're like, oh, here's some land. Let's keep going. And then now
exactly.
we're over here.
Exactly. It was just a normal migratory pattern. It's like, well, we'll just keep going. We're nomadic peoples and we're just going to walk until we find something that suits us.
Right.
And so that's kind of what they did. So the first wave of people to Alaska were likely coastal migrants from Asia. And so they were likely, I'm going to caveat there, likely the very first humans to cross into Alaska, with many continuing on and settling into Canada's interior and becoming sort of the predecessors to the Canadian Inuit peoples. But others would eventually become the Inuit and various Native American groups we know today in Alaska. And so more specifically, just to give them call outs, early Alaskans would divide themselves into the southeastern coastal tribes, such as the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. And then another tribe would be the Athabascans, Aleut, Inupiat, and Yupik, and then as well as the Alaskan Inuits. And so just to give our tribes a little bit of a call out. And a lot of these people still associate with these tribes today and still live there. In fact, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but Alaska has the highest percentage of indigenous peoples still living within their state today than any other state. So even the more so than Arizona, which has a very large Navajo reservation. Now, due to the weather, the climate, and just sort of the challenging terrain, these indigenous tribes would remain mostly isolated, not entirely, but mostly isolated from the world until their very first human colonizer. Hunter, who might I be talking about?
I'm thinking Russia, since it's pretty close.
It's absolutely Russia, which I think, and again, we're pretty accustomed to talking about colonizers, European colonizers in this podcast. We talk about them a lot. They've had a massive geographic impact on the world. But this is one of the few times where we talk about Russia rather than, let's say, Spain or England, Britain, France, or Portugal, or somebody else, right? So this is one of the very first times I think we actually get to talk about Russia as a European colonizer. So I think that's a little bit of a unique footnote in our podcast here. And so
than what we usually are talking about, but it adds up. I mean, this is, I don't know. Do you know the distance? I mean, it's pretty close, right? Between Alaska and Russia.
It is, but we're going to talk about sort of the distance factor here in a little bit. Because
good.
They are close and they're also not close.
Right.
If that makes any sense.
Right.
So
we're going to talk that are kind of close, but then everything else is not close.
Exactly. Yep. So we're going to talk all about Russia and sort of the history of colonization of Alaska. But first, we have to hit our very first ad break. So let's go ahead and do that right now. And we're back. We're talking about Geography is Alaska today, the largest state by area size in the United States and one of the more far-flung states, obviously, the other one being Hawaii, which we'll talk about next week. But we just left our first break talking about sort of the early history of Alaska, and now we're going to move into what I would call the colonization period, the colonization history of it. And so Hunter alluded to the fact that it was the Russians who were the very first colonizers there. So let's talk a little about who the Russians were at the time and why kind of they established a colony in Alaska of all places.
Let's do it.
So Russia would be the first European power to begin colonizing the region in the 1700s. So this would actually be kind of late as compared to other European colonization inside the Americas. I think Hernan Cortez was, I think somewhere around the late 1400s. The first colonies inside the eastern shore of what would be the United States, I think, was sort of in the late 1500s, early 1600s. I don't have these dates off the top of my head, but that's sort of what I'm recalling from memory.
In that neighborhood, yes.
In that neighborhood. So this would be kind of later. This is definitely significantly multi-decades later. But that said, it is theorized that Russian explorers could have arrived on the shores of Alaska in the mid-1600s, well before any sort of official settlement. That's not proven or anything. It's just a theory based on some sort of, maybe archaeological findings of that kind of stuff.
This is the kind of thing we might never know. Right. I mean, there's
Yeah, I
only
mean,
so much that we can know about history. It turns out maybe we find out new things. Maybe there's more archaeological discoveries, which cause us to think differently. But we have to go with the archaeological record as it stands. But of course, it might be longer.
right. And that's not to say that there weren't other, right? There's always theories, for example, that I can't remember if it was Chinese or Japanese naval or sailing vessels made it to somewhere along the west coast, or maybe even to Alaska of sort of North America. All of this could be true. I think there's always theories and sort of small little archaeological findings that sort of lend to that, maybe here and there. But again, until there's some sort of sufficient evidence, it's sort of all tossed up a little bit. And we're sort of like, maybe.
It's plausible.
Maybe it's possible. But let's talk a little about the actual colonization. So the Russian explorers made it to Alaska in the 1700s. This began Russia's American colonial ambitions. So the very first full Russian settlement was founded in 1784 on Kodiak Island.
Okay.
Now, this was founded by a man named Grigory Ivanovich Shelikov. And to be more specific, it was founded at Three Saints Bay on Kodiak Island. So listener, if you're not familiar with Kodiak Island, if you're watching on YouTube, obviously there's a picture of it sitting here right in front of you. But if you're not familiar with it, I'll walk you through it. It's a pretty large island. So it's not on the mainland. It's an island about 250 miles southwest of the current city of Anchorage. So if you know where sort of Anchorage is, it'd be about 250 miles southwest of that. So it's kind of an interesting place, I think, for a colony. It's not super hospitable. It is a large island, but it seems to get battered by the Pacific Ocean quite a bit. In fact, some videos I saw of it was like, wow, this is where you decided to make your first colony.
Seemed like a good idea at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Bold choice. So as with most tribes in the Americas, such as the Cherokee or the Navajo or the Iroquois Confederation, early contact with the Russian sort of colonizers or explorers would lead to significant Aleut population decline due to diseases and exploitation. So Aleuts were the primary indigenous tribes of that region around Kodiak, and so they would feel the brunt of it more so than almost any other tribe. And so obviously their populations would decline precipitously. Now, all this is to say, unlike the colonies of Spain or France or Great Britain, Russia's colonies in Alaska were never very profitable. In fact, they were very unprofitable. Now let's talk about the distance part. So you had alluded to this, Hunter, a little bit that, well, Russia, was probably the more obvious colonizer because it was relatively close to Russia. Mm-hmm. However, it's relatively close to Russia's far-flung eastern provinces.
Right, which has very little population.
Which has very little population. Today, the largest city would be, I think, Volgograd, which is sort of near Japan, down sort of the southeast part of Russia. Such a long country. Volgograd was not a big city back then, so it doesn't really play into the situation. Most of Russia's population centers were at the time, and still are, based in the far western part of their country, near, or I guess kind of in Europe, the cultural boundaries of Europe anyways, which was very far away from the new Alaskan colonies, given the transportation technologies of the time. And more to that point, the transportation technologies it's not just about planes, it's also about the shipping technology and whether or not you can actually even sail, because, well, at the time, all of the way that they would have to get to Alaska is through their Arctic Sea. And what might be an issue in the Arctic Sea, Hunter?
I'm guessing big chunks of ice, icebergs, stormy weather, and waters.
Yeah. And I mean, not even just big chunks of ice, but literal, like it's just frozen over. You can't,
right? Yeah.
For a large chunk of time, you were just not able to sail out of, St. Petersburg, Russia, to go anywhere, let alone Alaska. And so
also before modern communication, right? So it's, in addition to the transportation piece, there's very little, at the time, there would have been very little ability for particularly, power center in Moscow or in the eastern part of Russia to be able to communicate with anybody who's has activity in the Arctic and what is now Alaska.
Totally. And not only was it not very profitable, but it was also really hard, apparently, to sell to Russians to move to Alaska, to like
Right.
get them to like, hey, go help found this colony. Because Alaska, I mean, today it's inhospitable. During that time, it was very inhospitable. The world was much colder back then.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I think there's like a period of time called the Little Ice Age, which I think dates from around 1400s, maybe
Okay.
the
Yeah.
1300s to about the early 1900s. But it was this period of like time when like the world was just generally colder, not quite a full ice age, but everything was a little bit colder. And this would make a place like Alaska feel much worse than it does today. And so during the 17 and 1800s, the world was far colder, and it was just very hard to live there. Now, all that's to say, we've talked a little about Russia. All that's to say, Russia wasn't the only European colonizer with eyes on Alaska.
Okay.
They definitely had a big claim there. They had a settlement there, but the Spanish and British also believed that this area should belong to them. The Spanish apparently held that the entire region was theirs based on a proclamation made in the late 1400s, but no Spanish colonies or forts were ever founded in Alaska. In fact, I don't even think they're positive that Spanish explorers made it that far. I think
They heard of it. They knew about it. They saw it from a boat. They're like, that's ours. Yeah, we'll take that.
They probably had like a ship go up the coast and was like, yeah, this
Right.
is ours. This is ours. This is ours. We're the first to find it. Never mind all the people that are still living there today.
Right.
But and so that's kind of the extent of Spain's claims there. Likewise, the British would establish a few trading colonies in the mid 1700s, but most of Great Britain's colonial efforts were focused on the rest of British Canada, including their, at the time, this would be sort of late, or I guess now early 1800s, their ongoing dispute with the United States over the Oregon Country. Do you know what the Oregon Country is?
That is an area that was controlled by England, by the British, right? Before it
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah. And
yeah, I mean, this isn't an episode about it, but it was kind of the area that mostly comprises the current states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and the current Canadian province of British Columbia.
Right.
And it was this weird area that the two countries had sort of decided they were going to jointly control. And so it's sort of this weird,
because that usually works
very
out
weird.
well. Yeah.
Yeah. It'd probably be a fun episode to tackle because there's a lot of like historic nuance and sort of how things came to be. Right. There used to be this whole idea of or motto is called 54-40 or fight, which was like the Americans, living in Oregon at the time, basically saying we want the United States to own all the way up to the 54th latitude border, which is well into British Columbia, or we're going to go to war.
Right.
Obviously that didn't happen. We'll tackle it on
coming down the line.
But that was sort of Great Britain's focus at the time instead of Alaska. So they wanted it. They knew that was there. However, they had bigger sort of fish to fry. By the 1860s, the Russian government was ready to abandon its colony in Alaska. So it was basically, it's not profitable. It's hard to get settlers to move there. It's very inhospitable, doesn't make for a very fun living condition. So why do we even have this? Why do we care about this when Moscow, St. Petersburg, all of our major cities are so focused on Europe anyways? And there's a whole 1860, middle of the 1800s, a lot going on in Europe proper.
This is obviously before oil was a highly desired commodity. Yeah.
Totally. Yep. So just to give some context to this, overhunting on Kodiak Island and within sort of that region of Alaska severely reduced the fur-bearing animal population. And then competition from British and American fur traders made it far more unprofitable than it was even in the 1700s. This, combined with the difficulties of supplying and protecting such a distant colony, reduced the overall interest in the territory. And not least, Russia at the time was feeling like the Alaska territory would eventually fall into Britain's hands if they didn't do something. Now, Russia at the time, in the middle of the 1800s, and Britain, as well as a few other key players in Europe, were all competing fiercely, right? There's a large sort of undercurrent of imperial sort of, weight throwing around sort of who owns what and who's the biggest power.
The age of empire.
Exactly. And so Russia did not want Alaska this large territory of theirs to fall into Britain's hands and give them another, I guess, benefit or another bonus to sort of either their reputation or just their, something that they could claim, anything like that. And so instead, Russia, again, this is long before sort of the Cold War or any of that kind of stuff, they opted to sell the territory to the United States instead. And so in 1867, the United States and Russia formalized a sale of the Alaska territory for a grand total of $7.2 million, which seems like peanuts today.
Right. It's hard to know what that was, what the equivalent would have been, but it doesn't sound like a whole lot.
I mean, the equivalent, it could probably be worth, well over $100 million today, $200 million. I don't know the inflation. I'm not here to do that math. But even at $200 million, that would be a massive steal, right? So I think overall, it was still not a whole lot of money for such a large territory. But again, at the time, it was kind of thought of as like, well, there's nothing to do up here. It's very cold. Nobody's going to live up here. Good luck trying to get your settlers up here. There's nothing really. We've already killed all the animals for their furs. So what are you going to do?
A complete disregard for the fact that there had been people living there for thousands of years. We've said that, but yeah, it's
complete. Yep. Yeah. That was Russia's take. It's like, yeah,
right.
Sure, we'll take $7 million for this land that we've already exploited.
Right.
It's already done. And so the Alaska would become a U.S. territory, and it would be for quite a long period known as something called Seward's Folly. Do you know what Seward's Folly is?
Was Seward involved in the purchasing of Alaska?
This was the chief negotiator and maybe also ambassador for a time to Russia.
Okay. Yeah, and the idea was nobody knew how they could extract economic value from it, so it was seen as a lark. It was
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was seen as like, well, thanks for wasting our money, Seward. This was, kind of a bonehead move, and now we just have all this land that we can't even manage. And so it was known as that for quite a long time. Obviously, that's not going to end up being the case for into the future, and we'll talk a little about that in a minute. But Alaska would exist as a U.S. territory, almost as a military colony in the beginning. So it was a U.S. territory, but there wasn't a whole lot of, civilian activity, consumer activity, that kind of stuff. It was a military colony of sorts, with the military running the state between 1867 and 1884. So for almost 20 years there. From then, the U.S. president would appoint a governor to oversee the territory. So again, there's not really an election going on. And this would eventually start building to the point where it's becoming more of its own territory with its own systems. However, I thought this was a really funny fact. Apparently, cities within Alaska were not even able to be formally incorporated until the year 1900. And so the incorporation process for a city enables a lot of federal funding and enables a lot of different things. So, right, so if you're an unincorporated city, then you don't get a whole lot of, necessarily federal funds. There's just a whole lot that opens up. Alaska cities were not able, there was no mechanism, there was no legal mechanism based on their territorial status to be incorporated until the year 1900.
Okay, I see. And then just to step back for a second, the reason this isn't part of Canada is because Canada was part of the United Kingdom, and Russia was not interested in expanding their empire anymore. So that's why it's not part of Canada.
Exactly. And had Russia just decided to, let's say, not sell the territory of the U.S., or let's say the U.S. decided not to buy it because they're like, what are we going to do with that? The Alaska very likely would have fallen into what was then called British Canada's hands. It would it would probably just be another sort of large territory, maybe another northwestern territory. Maybe it would be part of the Yukon, maybe part of British Columbia. Who knows? But it would probably have fallen into Britain's hands. That would be my guess. It would take so from the year 1900, it would take another 59 years for Alaska to become a full state with the passing of the Alaska Statehood Act in 1959. And so this would be about 90 years from purchase and territory to given statehood. And I do believe that is the longest period of time that any place outside of the current territories that exist today, but of the current states, I believe that was the longest period of time between territory to statehood. Putting
aside the territories the U.S. controls that aren't states today.
Exactly. Yep. or even someplace like Washington, D.C., which is its whole other thing, but it's been around for a long time and does not have statehood status.
That's a different situation.
We're going to move on from history in a second. I want to some other historic points. I just want to call them out a little bit. So there was the 1964 earthquake. This was a really large earthquake that hit sort of the region of Anchorage, Alaska. It was to date, it is still the largest recorded earthquake on the North American continent. I think it was well over a 9.0. So this would be the same kind of earthquake. If you listen to our Cascadia subduction zone episode, this is the same kind of earthquake that will eventually hit somewhere off the coast of the Pacific Northwest here, off the coast of Oregon and Washington. And so that's maybe just a little bit of foreshadowing for maybe what we'll have to deal with at some point. But it was a monumental part of Alaskan history, and so that sort of leveled Anchorage, and they basically had to rebuild it later. And we are going to talk a little bit about this sort of at the end of today's episode. But later they would discover oil sort of in the middle of the 1900s. And this would lead to a huge economic boom for the state. And this would sort of be what would initially give the idea that there's value in Alaska. I would argue that there's a lot of value there without the oil. But
well, of course. Yeah. But from a strictly
from an economic point of view,
economic, imperial kind of sense, that changed everything.
Right. But this would also, lead to such tragedies such as the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which I actually don't have strong memories. I believe that happened in the early 1990s or maybe mid 1990s. But anyways, it was a large tanker that sort of ran aground or was hit by, something and spilled a bunch of oil into a bay and basically caused before the Mariana Trench, Gulf of Mexico oil disaster was probably the largest oil disaster
not Mariana Trench and Gulf of Mexico.
Not Mariana Trench?
No, something else.
Oh,
yeah.
Something else. Well, whatever. The Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That Gulf of Mexico incident was the largest single incident involving oil, rushing into the ocean. Although collectively, there's a few other parts of the world that there's so many smaller disasters that they, together they add up to more damage. But yeah, Exxon Valdez, that was a big one.
Right. And so with that, let's go ahead and hit our final ad break. And then we're going to come back. We're going to talk about Alaska's global prominence and maybe talk a little about oil, and maybe we'll talk a little about Russia again. So we will be right back. And we're back. We're talking about the state of Alaska on our episode today. Geography is Everything is the podcast. And we're going to wrap it up by talking about sort of the global prominence of the state. Because, again, I think we think of Alaska as this sort of far-flung territory where there's not a whole lot up there or something like that. There's just a lot of big country, not a whole lot of people. And so we often don't think about it too often. However, there is a case to be made that it is perhaps the most important state the United States has. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm not saying that it is. I'm just saying that potentially there's an argument.
The argument can be made. Yep.
The argument can be made. And I think it's a stronger argument than at least a lot of other states can make. I'm not going to call out specific states. I'm not trying to put up a contest here.
Connecticut's pretty important, I feel like.
Connecticut, every state and territory is important.
Right? For the people who live there, it's important.
Exactly. So Alaska is very important for the United States strategic military operations today. So the whole state of Alaska and its biggest city of Anchorage are both located near the North Pole. Hunter, why might that be important?
Well, there's a lot of international jockeying for control of the Arctic. And so that maybe has something to do with it.
It absolutely does. There's a few different reasons why this all has. There's a lot of reasons that are sort of piled in here. You hit on one of them, which is the North Pole, which has historically been very icy and so therefore impassable, is starting to become more passable. And that's allowed for, one, areas to be opened up for resource extraction, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, but also just for navigation purposes, right? So being able to move things in and around to other places has become a lot easier. And as it turns out, if you're in the North Pole or close to the North Pole, you're actually much closer to a lot of other places than you would be if you are, let's say, down here in the contiguous United States. So if we draw a straight line So from Anchorage, a straight line to Beijing, China, the
Okay.
distance is about 3,970 miles,
Wow. Okay.
which sounds like a lot. We're going to put this into context in
Yeah,
a
but
second.
it doesn't. I mean, that's the distance from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States. About.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, if we use another geopolitical competitor, so from Anchorage to Moscow is 4,342 miles. To use a different sort of maybe not geopolitical competitor, let's say an ally, Anchorage to Tokyo is 3,457 miles.
Mm-hmm.
And then Anchorage to Berlin, Germany would be 4,523 miles. To put this number in perspective and to add this context, if we were to draw a straight line distance from Washington, D.C. to Moscow, that is over 4,900 miles.
Okay.
And so, if we look at sort of our flat maps, right? You have your flat map, it's a big rectangle or big square if you're looking at a Mercator map. It's not obvious that flying from Anchorage to, up here all the way to the other side of the map that you're looking at, say Moscow, it's not obvious that that is closer. In fact, it seems much farther away than Washington, D.C.
Yeah, this is when one of the projections where you're looking at the poles themselves would reveal what you're talking about. And it helps us understand and visualize these distances if you are flying over the North Pole or over the Arctic is much different than flying across the Atlantic or Pacific or something like that.
Exactly. And so, so when you're able to fly over the North Pole, as it turns out, you're much closer to everybody. And it's because of that aspect, right? You don't need to fly across the Atlantic. You don't need to fly across, only in one direction. You can fly up and over. The other example I have here is LA or Los Angeles to Beijing is over 6,200 miles. And again, that's not something that would seem obvious. You would actually assume, well, it's just over across the Pacific. Right. The Pacific Ocean is quite large.
Pretty big. Yep.
Yeah. And so because of these shorter distances, the U.S. military has a huge force stationed in Alaska year-round. So as you listen to this, listener, or watching this if you're on YouTube, there are over 22,000 Air Force, Navy, Army, and Marine Corps personnel, along with 4,700 guardsmen and reservists that are operating within Alaska today. I guess maybe that could fluctuate a little bit depending on the seasonality, but broadly, that's sort of how many people are generally stationed at any given time. And with Alaska's strategic location we just talked about, the U.S. military can deploy almost anywhere in the northern hemisphere in very little time. We're not talking days, we're talking hours.
So from a geopolitical military standpoint, it's a very strategic location to be able to operate from.
Very strategic. So again, this sort of lends to and again, if we think back to, when Alaska first became a territory, it was run by the military. You can start to see this evident in sort of its history as well. Mm-hmm. And so this remains a very prominent military installation for the U.S. federal government. But let's shift gears here a little bit. Let's talk a little bit more about sort of the consumer logistics. We've talked about the strategic military logistics. Let's talk about what this means for me, you, and everybody else. So for all the same reasons as we previously covered for the military, there exists a huge freight terminal for air cargo in Anchorage. And so this would be things, coming from broadly, but mostly, Asia, but, probably more specifically China, will fly into Anchorage and then sort of get dispersed from there. According to the U.S. Department of Transportation, over 1.6 million tons of freight flew through Alaska in 2021. Now, these are big numbers, and let's give something to compare it to as we usually try and do. So let's use California. In California, a massive state. In fact, it's about 55 times larger in terms of population. California had about 2.1 million tons of air. Sorry, we're talking about air freight. 2.1 million tons of air freight go through it. And so Alaska is punching way above its weight in terms of air cargo.
for shipping, though, California still remains. I think Long Beach is one of the largest ports in the country. So it'd be interesting to see if that changes over time, if it becomes less viable with jet fuel or something like that. But at the moment,
it could.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't compare because there's also trains. There's train freight, truck freight, ship freight and then air freight, right? There's sort of four kinds of things that are sort of get classified. I think obviously California would dwarf Alaska in shipping freight.
Right.
I don't know if Alaska really has very much train freight because they do have a relatively small train network, but it's not connected, if I remember correctly, to anything else.
Okay.
And then obviously their highways are also not super well connected. So I don't think they have a huge amount of truck freight. So it's mostly air freight, but it's growing. There's a huge operation underway to expand the Anchorage airport there, not for consumers necessarily. I think that might be a little bit of it, but to enable more freight to come in through air, right? Mm-hmm. So UPS, FedEx, all these places, DHL can fly in and drop stuff off or pick stuff up and then, jet back to wherever it's going to go, whether it's Europe or the United States or Canada or where. Getting back to it, so I think bottom line, in terms of air cargo, shipping freight through Alaska apparently cuts down on travel costs quite a bit in terms of it's not cheap to fly things at all. And so this helps cut down that sort of travel aspect, the travel costs of it. And we talked already about this, but while air freight transportation is incredibly important, the receding ice of the Arctic Ocean is starting to enable more shipping freight to traverse through the area. And so
the Arctic's becoming more navigable than before.
It's becoming more navigable, right? So there's new potential trade routes in international waters that are close to the North Pole. And so the prospect of a maritime link between the Arctic between Japan, China, and the United States is growing. And it's theorized it'll become one of the primary strategic freight routes for the United States in the future.
Wow.
Not there yet, but it's
right.
If things keep going, it's theorized that will probably be a big one. But in all this talk about sort of the current strategic consumer logistic, benefits of Alaska, there's also something to consider with respect to the future. And so I think it's safe to say climate change is here. We're living in it. This is a thing that's happening.
It's happening.
It's happening. And this is going to yield benefits for some areas, a lot of consequences for a lot of areas. Scientists certainly weren't predicting the kind of rampant climate change we're beginning to experience today, though some were starting to sound the alarm in the 1800s. But it's turned out to be kind of a wise investment, looking back to that 1967 sale, kind of a wise investment for the U.S. in terms of future resource gathering. And this, listener, is not to say that it's just benefits for Alaska and for climate change. There are a lot of consequences for that state as well.
Absolutely.
But there are certainly advantages for the U.S. on a strategic global level. So according to the National Climate Assessment, which is a sort of a part of, I believe, the EPA or the USDA, I can't remember which bureau, but it's a research group within that department. Alaska is heating at a rate that's twice as fast as the rest of the United States. And so it's warming up faster.
Right.
And we see this with the polar regions on both ends, right? The polar regions are dramatically, increasing in heat much faster. And this has already caused widespread sort of glacier melt, reduced sea ice that we already talked about with respect to shipping freight, reduced permafrost, that's sort of the frost that sort of lies within the soils that makes it very inhospitable to growing anything. And the reduced permafrost also leads to something called the drunken forest effect, where if you go up to Alaska now, it's not uncommon to see a bunch of trees that are sort of leaning over and sort of like tilted to the sides, and it's because of this.
I've not heard that term before.
Yeah, it's quite popular up in Alaska. That's how they sort of refer to it as. And of course, an overall drier climate, which leads to larger and more dangerous wildfires. Those are all of the consequences. But there are some advantages. So it turns out owning Alaska during the age of climate change could lead to, some are theorizing, a new breadbasket for the United States.
Interesting.
So current climate change models are predicting that the traditional breadbasket regions of the country, such as the California Central Valley and the Midwest, will become drier, making growing a vast quantity of crops challenging, to say the least. We don't know exactly how challenging, but the models are out there saying it's going to get harder. So, brace yourselves. But Alaska, a huge state that already has a lot of fresh water. In fact, it has the most amount of rivers and streams going through it than any other state, could pose as a potential solution to the Central Valley and Midwest sort of producing less.
Interesting.
So between now and the year 2100, again, this is according to that same organization, between now and the year 2100, the amount of days Alaska is expected to be able to farm food will double. Now, this isn't a lot. This isn't a huge change, but overall, given the amount of land available, there could be a massive benefit there.
Yeah,
exactly. And so this means that food that normally wouldn't have been able to be grown in Alaska due to the amount of time required in a warmer weather will suddenly become more viable. And so things such as wheat, which is not currently really able to be grown in Alaska, could be grown in Alaska in the future. Right. And other grains such as barley could also become a large agricultural product for Alaska, just as it becomes less viable to grow in the South, in the contiguous United States. And not only will the growing days double, but the amount of land available to grow on will expand more than 100 times. And so right now, there's only a small chunk of land that's sort of, I want to say near Fairbanks, Alaska, okay. Maybe a little bit south of that they try and do some limited agriculture in. This will grow more than 100 times. And so that's quite the expansion, I think.
Right. So it's not all crops. I mean, they're not going to be growing coffee or bananas or mangoes or anything, but some staple crops. Looks like there's some potential for expansion.
And things like potatoes. Potatoes will probably be, I mean, we've talked quite a bit on this podcast about how hardy of a vegetable that is. Mm-hmm. So that'll probably become a lot more viable.
It's a tuber.
Exactly. And so all this is to say is there are definitely going to be benefits here. And we talked about how Alaska was called Seward's Folly at one point, but I think this is starting to prove to maybe be one of the most, based on everything we've talked about, one of the most important states. This is sort of the argument that's sort of building. It's like, okay, maybe Alaska is turning out to be one of the most important states the United States has ever could have wished for to have.
Not so much of a folly anymore.
Not so much of a folly. And so with that, to end our episode today, I want to briefly talk about oil because it's an episode about Alaska. We have to talk about it a little bit. I didn't want to make it the focal point, but it would be unfair, I guess, to leave it out entirely. And so Alaska has been and continues to be a very large oil producing state since its discovery in 1968, when the company Arco, which I think those of us on the West Coast are pretty familiar with, discovered oil in Alaska's far northern region known as Prudhoe Bay.
Right.
And if you're sort of caught up on sort of the current politics of oil extraction and everything, this would be the same general region as the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, also known as ANWR or ANWR. And this is an area that, depending on the politics at any given time, the oil companies are always trying to open up for more drilling because they want to be able to extract more oil, which is kind of crazy because according to estimates in the current fields that are available to drill in Alaska, there are about 3.13 billion barrels of oil sort of still waiting to be extracted.
So those are the estimates right now.
Those are the estimates. Now, to put this number in perspective, to give context, to date, since 1968, about 164 million barrels have been extracted. And so there's still a lot of oil left there, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Today, as we talk about this right now, there are about 319,000 barrels extracted every day from Alaska. Quite a lot.
That's a lot of barrels. Yeah.
This is down from the height of about 1.5 billion barrels per day in 1988. And so it's still a lot. There's still a lot of barrels being extracted. But all this oil leads to one very particular thing in Alaska that is called the permanent fund dividend. Have you ever heard about this, Hunter?
I have. Yeah. And this is like a kicker, right? This is money that citizens of Alaska receive related to oil.
Exactly. This is so most states, not all, but most states have an income tax. We're here in Oregon. Oregon takes a little piece of our paychecks, and then that goes towards things like roads and whatever. All things that taxes do. Alaska not only does not have an income tax, but rather it pays its residents once per year based on the profits and revenues from its oil, from its oil reserves. And so in 2022, the dividend, and this is yearly, the dividend was $3,284.
Okay.
Just for living and breathing in Alaska. And
Right.
so
You still have to pay federal tax, but no state
you still
tax.
have to pay federal tax. And I'm not sure how that factors into your federal tax. I don't know.
Right.
That's not, I'm not an accountant, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
CPAs might know this. We don't know this.
We don't know this. This is a geography podcast, but I think it's kind of an amazing fact, right? I think it's the only state in the country that has a kind of a universal basic income is what you could almost call it. It's like something that you just get just for being there, just for living there.
And that's a flat rate for everybody?
Flat rate for everybody, yeah. Okay. I'm not sure how that factors in, like, if you were to move up today, I don't know if you would have to be there for a year before you get it. Like you'd be able to collect it for the 2025 year. I don't know. These are all questions I don't have the answer to, but I do know if you do move up there and you do live up there for a significant time, those checks will start to come in.
I see.
Or maybe it's prorated. I don't know. Well, with that, Hunter, I think we got to bring this one to a close. This one's getting a little long, so we said a lot about Alaska.
We learned a lot.
Yeah. Do you want to do your pluggables?
Thanks, Geoff. I'm Hunter Shoby. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I am co-author of Portland is a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. My co-author is David Banis. And with you, Geoff, I am co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything.
Yeah, my name is Geoff Gibson. I am the co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything. You can also find me over on YouTube. That's youtube.com/little_geography by Geoff. More fun videos, geography, whatever. Go check it out. It's always fun. If you want to find us around the web elsewhere, you can check out our Substack. That's geographyiseverything.substack.com. If you liked listening to this episode all about Alaska, you learned a lot, you thought it was really fun, engaging conversation about Alaska, please rate and review us or like and subscribe to us on YouTube. Both of those things really help us out. We really appreciate seeing those and seeing our numbers go up. It's always, just highly complimentary. Next week, as I already alluded to at the beginning of this episode, we're going to talk all about the United States' other far-flung state, Hawaii. Hunter, give us a little teaser about Hawaii.
Well, we'll be talking about Hawaii in the Wayback Machine because we like to go in the Wayback Machine. We'll talk about this pivotal time in the 17 and 1800s where the United States started to intervene and then eventually it becomes a U.S. territory and a U.S. state. And we'll talk about some of the challenges that Hawaii is facing on a number of different levels. So that's all coming up next week.
Yeah, it should be, again, I think it's a great pairing with Alaska because they're two very far-flung sort of states of the United States, but their stories are going to be very different. And both states have their advantages and their weaknesses and sort of their own very unique pathways into the United States. And that should be a really fun one. I think people are going to get a kick out of it. So come back next week. We're going to learn all about Hawaii. And I guess until then, we'll see you then.
Thanks for listening.